stop crying and sign the papers already," my son whispered while his father's coffin was being lowered into the ground. The cold October wind moved through the cemetery in slow waves, carrying the scent of damp earth and dying leaves across the rows of gray headstones. For a moment, I honestly thought I had misunderstood him. My hearing wasn't what it used to be at 70 years old, and grief had wrapped itself around my mind like heavy fog since Thomas passed away 6 days earlier. But then Ryan pressed the folder gently against my black wool coat and lowered his voice again, this time with quiet impatience. "Mom, the lawyer is waiting in the car. We just need your signature." I stared at him without speaking. My son avoided my eyes as two funeral workers carefully adjusted the straps around my husband's mahogany coffin. Thomas Carter had spent 43 years building a life beside me. 43 years of mortgage payments, summer vacations in Maine, Christmas mornings beside the fireplace, arguments over paint colors, laughter over burned pancakes, late-night conversations in bed while rain tapped against the windows. And now all that remained of him was a polished wooden box disappearing inch by inch beneath the earth, while our only son worried about paperwork. Claire stood several feet behind Ryan beneath a large black umbrella, her blonde hair tucked neatly beneath a designer scarf. Even from a distance, she looked composed. Too composed. Her pale blue eyes briefly met mine before sliding toward the folder in Ryan's hands. That was when I understood something I should have seen long ago. This moment had been planned. Maybe not here beside the grave itself, but the pressure, the timing, the rehearsed patience in Ryan's voice. None of this was accidental. The pastor continued speaking softly about eternal peace and loving memories, but his words faded into background noise. My attention stayed fixed on my son's trembling fingers resting against the folder. Ryan used to cry whenever he saw me upset. When he was 8 years old, he once burst into tears because I burned my hand pulling a casserole from the oven. Thomas laughed and said our son had inherited my soft heart. Standing there in the cemetery, I wondered when that soft heart disappeared. Or maybe it hadn't disappeared at all. Maybe someone had slowly replaced it with something colder. "Mom," Ryan whispered again, his jaw tightening slightly. "Please don't make today harder than it already is." Harder. I almost laughed at the word. My husband had died from heart failure in the kitchen of our Connecticut home while reaching for his coffee mug. One second he was asking if we still had cinnamon bagels, and the next second he was collapsing onto the hardwood floor while I screamed for an ambulance that arrived too late. Since then, our home had become unbearably quiet. Thomas's reading glasses still rested beside his favorite recliner. His navy windbreaker still hung near the garage door. Every room carried traces of him, like warmth refusing to leave after sunset. And yet somehow, less than a week after burying him, my son had already decided paperwork mattered more than grief. I looked down at the folder. My hands trembled slightly beneath my gloves as I opened it. Legal documents. Signature tabs marked neatly in yellow. Property transfer forms. Trust amendments. Temporary financial authority. Claire had organized everything perfectly. That much was obvious. Ryan cleared his throat beside me. Dad wanted things simplified if something happened. There it was. The sentence people use when speaking for the dead because the dead can no longer argue. I slowly closed the folder again. The coffin had nearly disappeared now, leaving only polished wood visible between the lowering straps. My chest tightened so sharply I thought I might lose my balance. Thomas deserved better than this moment. Better than whispered legal pressure beside his grave. Better than watching his family quietly fracture before the dirt even touched the coffin lid. I swallowed hard and lifted my eyes toward the cloudy gray sky. The wind brushed against my cheeks, cold and thin like winter approaching too early. Then I did something Ryan clearly wasn't expecting. I nodded gently and took the pen from his hand. Relief immediately flooded his face. Claire exhaled softly beneath her umbrella. Neither of them noticed the way my fingers tightened around the pen. Neither of them noticed the sudden calm settling over me like ice forming across still water. Because in that exact moment, while my husband was still being lowered into the ground, I realized something important. My son believed grief had made me weak. Claire believed age had made me confused. And both of them were about to make the biggest mistake of their lives. The house sounded different after the funeral. That was the first thing I noticed when we returned from the cemetery. Silence has weight when someone you love is gone. It settles into corners. It stretches across ceilings. It lingers in doorways long after everyone else stops noticing it. I stood alone in the front hallway while Ryan carried in leftover flower arrangements from the service. White lilies, roses, small sympathy cards tucked between ribbons. The entire living room smelled like funeral flowers and cold rain. For 43 years, Thomas had filled this house with noise without even trying. The sound of football games from the den on Sunday afternoons. His habit of humming old Frank Sinatra songs while making coffee. The way he always cleared his throat before speaking whenever he thought carefully about something. Now every room felt hollow, like the walls themselves understood he was never coming back. Claire walked into the kitchen and immediately began organizing aluminum catering trays from the reception luncheon. She moved quickly, efficiently, like someone cleaning up after a corporate event instead of a burial. "We should freeze some of this food before it goes bad," she said casually while opening cabinets. I watched her for a moment without answering. It struck me then how comfortable she had become in my kitchen. She knew exactly where everything was. Storage containers, foil, garbage bags, even the expensive serving platters Thomas and I only used during holidays. I wondered how many quiet changes had happened around me over the years without my noticing. Ryan loosened his black tie and sat heavily at the kitchen island. He looked exhausted, but not heartbroken. There is a difference. Grief softens people. Exhaustion only irritates them. "Dad would not want you alone tonight," he said finally. "Claire and I can stay here for a few days." The wording sounded kind on the surface, but something underneath it made my stomach tighten. "A few days. Not with you. Here." I slowly removed my gloves and folded them carefully beside my purse. "That is thoughtful," I said quietly. Claire glanced toward Ryan before forcing a small smile in my direction. "You should not have to worry about anything right now, Evelyn. Let us handle things for a while." Handle things. Another phrase people use when they have already started making decisions for you. I walked slowly toward the den where Thomas spent most evenings reading financial newspapers with his reading glasses balanced low on his nose. His leather recliner sat exactly where he left it 6 days earlier. A coffee mug still rested on the side table beside a folded newspaper dated October 12th. I picked it up carefully, tracing the rim with my fingertips. His fingerprints were probably still there somewhere. The thought nearly broke me. Upstairs, I could hear drawers opening and closing inside the guest bedroom where Ryan and Claire planned to sleep. The sound echoed through the hallway like strangers settling into a hotel. I lowered myself slowly into Thomas's chair and stared at the dark television screen across the room. The funeral folder still rested inside my purse near the front door. I had signed one page at the cemetery. Only one. Not because I trusted Ryan, but because I needed time to think clearly. Claire had pushed the remaining documents toward me before we left the gravesite, but I told her my hands were shaking too badly to continue. She looked disappointed for only half a second before replacing her polite expression. That tiny moment stayed with me. Disappointment, not concern. Around 7 o'clock, Ryan entered the den carrying 2 glasses of water. He handed one to me before sitting on the sofa across from Thomas's chair. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Rain tapped gently against the windows while the grandfather clock near the staircase marked each passing second with painful precision. "Mom," he finally said carefully, "there are going to be a lot of financial decisions coming up soon." There it was again. Not memories. Not grief. Not his father. Financial decisions. I kept my eyes on the untouched glass in my hands. "Your father handled most things," I replied softly. I never paid much attention to paperwork. Ryan relaxed slightly at those words. I noticed immediately. "Exactly," he said. "That is why Claire and I want to help simplify everything before it becomes stressful for you." I nodded slowly without looking at him. Let him believe I was overwhelmed. Let him believe grief had made me fragile. Sometimes people reveal the truth faster when they think you are too weak to notice it. A few minutes later, Claire entered carrying a stack of neatly organized folders against her chest. Blue tabs marked each section in perfect handwriting. Property taxes, trust accounts, insurance policies, medical bills. She placed them carefully across the kitchen island like a banker preparing for a meeting. "Nothing urgent tonight," she said sweetly. "But maybe tomorrow we can go through everything together." Together. I looked at the folders, then at my son standing beside his wife. Thomas had not even been buried for 3 full hours, and already they were building a future that did not seem to include me. And for the first time since losing my husband, Something colder than grief began settling quietly inside my chest. The next morning, I woke before sunrise to the sound of cabinet doors closing downstairs. For a few disoriented seconds, I reached toward Thomas's side of the bed, expecting to feel the familiar warmth of his shoulder beneath the blankets. My hand touched cold sheets instead. That emptiness hurt more than anything else. Grief arrives in waves, but sometimes it hides inside ordinary habits. The realization that there would never again be a second coffee mug beside mine in the morning nearly brought tears to my eyes. I sat up slowly and wrapped my robe tighter around myself, while pale gray light filtered through the bedroom curtains. Thomas always opened those curtains before I woke up because he liked natural light in the mornings. He used to joke that sunlight made people less likely to become bitter. Standing there alone beside our king-sized bed, I wondered what he would think if he could see what was happening now. Downstairs, Claire's voice floated softly through the kitchen. Calm, organized, efficient. By the time I reached the bottom of the staircase, she had already prepared breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, fresh fruit arranged neatly on a serving tray. Ryan sat at the kitchen island scrolling through emails on his phone while half drinking a cup of coffee. Neither of them looked like people mourning a loss. They looked like people managing a project. Good morning, Claire said brightly. I made breakfast because you should not have to worry about cooking right now. I thanked her quietly and sat down at the far end of the island. The marble countertop felt cold beneath my fingertips. Ryan barely looked up from his phone. The probate office called, he said casually. There are a few things we need to organize this week. Probate office. Organize. Every sentence out of his mouth sounded transactional now. I forced myself to take a small bite of toast, even though my stomach felt hollow. There is no rush, I said softly. Ryan exchanged a quick glance with Claire before setting his phone down. Actually, there kind of is, he replied. Dad left a lot of financial accounts, investments, taxes. It gets complicated if paperwork sits too long. Claire stepped in smoothly before the tension could fully settle. We just want to protect you from unnecessary stress, Evelyn. Again, that careful tone. Sweet enough to sound caring. Controlled enough to avoid sounding manipulative. I realized then that Claire rarely called me mom anymore. It had slowly changed over the years. First during disagreements. Then during holidays. Now she used my first name almost exclusively, as if distancing herself emotionally made her feel more powerful. After breakfast, Ryan carried several folders into Thomas's old home office while Claire began cleaning dishes. I stood quietly near the sink watching her movements. She wore cream-colored cashmere even while washing plates. Everything about her always looked expensive and perfectly maintained. You must be exhausted, she said without turning around. This house is probably going to feel overwhelming for a while. I said nothing. She dried her hands carefully before continuing. Ryan and I have talked about maybe helping you downsize eventually. Somewhere easier to maintain. Less isolated. There it was. Finally spoken aloud. Not directly. Not cruelly. But clearly enough. I stared through the kitchen window toward the backyard where Thomas spent every spring planting roses beside the fence line. He loved that garden more than any vacation we ever took. Your father built this home himself, I replied quietly. He laid half those floorboards with his own hands. Claire smiled politely, but there was impatience hiding underneath it now. And it is beautiful. But homes this large become difficult at your age. At your age? Such a simple phrase. Such a cold one. Before I could answer, Ryan called from the office. Mom, can you come in here for a second? Thomas's office smelled faintly like cedarwood and old paper. Bookshelves lined the walls beside framed photographs from decades of family vacations. Ryan stood behind the desk while stacks of financial documents covered the polished surface in neat piles. I noticed immediately that Thomas's desk drawers were slightly open. Someone had already gone through them. I found the property insurance files, Ryan said, but I cannot locate the updated trust documents. My heartbeat slowed slightly. Updated. So there had been changes. Your father handled those things privately, I answered carefully. Ryan rubbed the back of his neck in frustration. Did he ever mention where he kept copies? I looked around the office slowly before shaking my head. It was not entirely a lie. Thomas rarely discussed financial details with anyone. But during the last few months of his life, he had become strangely protective of certain documents. At the time, I assumed it was because of his declining health. Now I was beginning to wonder if there had been another reason entirely. Claire stepped into the office doorway holding a yellow folder. "Maybe this will help," she said smoothly. She handed me several pages already marked with sticky notes where signatures were required. Temporary asset authority, banking permissions, home transfer review acknowledgement. My chest tightened as I scanned the pages. The wording sounded harmless at first glance, but Thomas taught me years ago to pay attention to legal language hidden between simple sentences. Some of these documents gave Ryan broad financial control if signed together, much broader than necessary. I slowly lowered the papers back onto the desk. "I am too tired today," I said quietly. Ryan exhaled sharply through his nose before catching himself. "Mom, we are only trying to help." I looked directly at my son then, really looked at him. The dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the impatience he kept trying to disguise as concern. And beneath all of it, something else. Fear. Not grief. Fear. Because whatever they expected from Thomas's death had clearly not happened yet. That afternoon, after Ryan and Claire left to meet with someone from the funeral home about final invoices, I finally found myself alone in the house for the first time since Thomas died. The silence felt different without them there. Cleaner somehow. I stood in the middle of the kitchen holding a dish towel in my hands while rain drifted softly against the windows overlooking the backyard. The roses along the fence had started losing their petals in the cold October weather. Thomas hated when summer ended. Every year he complained that Connecticut became too gray after September. I could almost hear his voice in my head as I slowly walked toward the hallway leading to our bedroom. Halfway there, my eyes drifted toward the small antique cabinet beside the staircase. Thomas always kept random things there. Flashlights, batteries, old receipts, spare keys. For some reason I could not explain, I stopped walking and opened the bottom drawer. Inside sat a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. My heartbeat slowed. I recognized it immediately. Thomas used to carry that key on his office keyring for years. "Just old paperwork," he always said whenever I asked what it opened. Strange memories began surfacing one after another as I held the key in my palm. 6 months ago, Thomas changed banks without explaining why. 3 months ago, he installed a new lock on his office filing cabinet. 2 weeks before he died, I walked into the kitchen late at night and found him sitting alone at the table staring at paperwork with a look I had never seen before. Not anger, not confusion, disappointment. When he noticed me standing there, he quickly folded the papers closed and smiled too fast. "Could not sleep," he told me. At the time, I believed him. Now I was not so sure. I carried the brass key upstairs and sat carefully on the edge of our bed. Thomas's side still looked untouched because I could not bring myself to disturb it. His navy slippers remained beside the dresser exactly where he left them. One of his sweaters still hung over the reading chair near the window. I pressed the key tightly between my fingers while another memory surfaced unexpectedly. 3 weeks before his death, Thomas asked me a strange question while we were grocery shopping. We had been standing in the cereal aisle debating whether the expensive coffee beans were worth buying when he suddenly looked at me very seriously and said, "If something ever happened to me, would you trust Ryan to take care of things fairly?" The question caught me so off guard that I laughed at first. "Of course," I told him. "He is our son." Thomas nodded slowly, but he did not look reassured. I remember that clearly now. At the time, I assumed he was simply worried about aging. Retirement changes people. Illness changes people even more. But sitting there alone in our bedroom, I finally understood what had unsettled me about that conversation. Thomas had not been asking about money. He had been asking about trust. A cold feeling settled into my chest. I stood quickly and walked toward his office downstairs. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and dust. Afternoon light stretched across the bookshelves in long pale strips while the grandfather clock ticked softly somewhere down the hallway. I locked the office door behind me before kneeling beside the old wooden filing cabinet near the window. The brass key slid perfectly into the bottom drawer lock. My hands trembled slightly as I turned it. Inside sat several neatly organized folders and a small black lockbox. I stared at it for several seconds before carefully lifting the lid. The first thing I saw was my husband's handwriting. Thick blue ink across a sealed white envelope. "For Evelyn. Only if necessary." My throat tightened instantly. Beneath the envelope sat copies of legal documents, bank statements, insurance policies, and a flash drive sealed inside a plastic evidence bag. Evidence. The word alone made my pulse quicken. Thomas never dramatized things. If he labeled something evidence, then he believed something was seriously wrong. I picked up the envelope carefully and traced his handwriting with my fingertips. Even after 43 years of marriage, I still recognized every detail of the way he formed letters. My vision blurred slightly as tears finally gathered in my eyes. "What did you know?" I whispered into the empty room. For several moments, I simply sat there holding the envelope while the rain continued tapping softly against the windows. Then I heard a car door slam outside. Ryan and Claire were back. Instantly, instinct replaced grief. I slid everything carefully back into the lockbox except the envelope, then locked the cabinet again just as footsteps approached the front hallway. Claire's voice floated faintly through the house. "Maybe tomorrow we should call the realtor just to discuss options." Realtor. Options. I closed my eyes slowly. They were already planning a future inside this house, while my husband's clothes still hung in the closet upstairs. But for the first time since Thomas died, I no longer felt confused. I felt certain. Thomas had seen something before he passed away, something serious enough to prepare for in secret. And whatever my husband left inside that envelope was about to change everything. That night, I waited until the house became quiet before opening the envelope Thomas left for me. Ryan and Claire had gone upstairs around 10:30 after another long conversation whispered behind closed doors in the guest bedroom. I could hear faint movement through the ceiling while I sat alone at the kitchen table beneath the soft yellow light above the island. The same table where Thomas drank coffee every morning for nearly 2 decades. The same table where we celebrated birthdays, argued over politics, helped Ryan with homework, and planned retirement trips we never got to take. I ran my fingers slowly across the envelope seal before opening it carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded in half. Thomas always wrote by hand when something mattered deeply to him. His penmanship looked slightly shakier than usual, probably from the medication he started taking during his final months. I unfolded the paper slowly while my heart pounded hard enough to make my chest ache. "Evelyn," the letter began. "If you are reading this, then something has already confirmed the fear I could never fully explain to you while I was alive." I stopped breathing for a moment. Outside, rain continued tapping softly against the kitchen windows while the refrigerator hummed quietly behind me. The entire house felt frozen in place. I tried convincing myself for months that I was imagining things, Thomas wrote. But I have spent my entire career reading people, and eventually patterns become impossible to ignore. My eyes moved quickly across the page now. Ryan has changed. Claire influences him more than he realizes, and together they have become increasingly interested in things that do not belong to them yet. A cold chill moved through me, not because I was surprised anymore, but because Thomas had carried these fears alone. I noticed missing financial documents last spring. Then I discovered unauthorized conversations with our accountant regarding property transfers and trust structures. When I confronted Ryan indirectly, he became defensive immediately. Claire denied everything, of course. I pressed my hand against my mouth as tears blurred the ink slightly. Thomas never liked conflict. For him to secretly investigate our own son meant he truly believed something was wrong. The next lines hurt the most. "I did not tell you because I hoped I was mistaken. You love Ryan without conditions, and I could not bear destroying that unless I absolutely had to." I lowered my eyes for several seconds. My husband had tried protecting both me and our son at the same time, even while dying, especially while dying. Further down the page, Thomas's writing became firmer again. Inside the lockbox are copies of every important legal document. The real trust remains protected under Harold Bennett's supervision. Do not sign anything Ryan or Claire bring you without Harold present, no matter how much pressure they apply. Harold Bennett, Thomas's old attorney and closest friend from college. Suddenly several things made sense. The private lunches, the unexplained meetings downtown, the locked office drawers. Thomas had been quietly preparing for this possibility long before his heart failed him. I reached for the flash drive next. My hands shook slightly as I carried my laptop onto the kitchen table and inserted it carefully. Several audio files appeared on the screen along with scanned bank records and legal correspondence. I clicked the first recording almost without thinking. At first there was only muffled restaurant noise, silverware clinking, soft music. Then Claire's voice became clear enough to recognize instantly. "We cannot keep waiting forever," she said quietly. The house alone is worth almost $2 million now. My stomach twisted violently. Ryan answered in a low, tense voice I barely recognized. Dad would never cut Mom out completely. Claire sighed impatiently. Nobody is saying completely. But if things are not reorganized now, everything gets tied up legally for years. Silence followed briefly before Claire spoke again. Honestly, Ryan, your mother does not need this entire house anymore. I paused the recording immediately. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too warm. I stared at the dark laptop screen while my heartbeat echoed painfully inside my ears. It was one thing to suspect manipulation. It was another thing entirely to hear your son discussing your future like a financial inconvenience. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly. Instinctively, I closed the laptop and removed the flash drive. For several moments I sat completely still, listening to the silence. Then something unexpected happened inside me. The grief remained. The betrayal remained. But beneath both of them, another feeling began taking shape. Clarity. Thomas had not left me helpless. He had left me prepared. Slowly, I folded his letter back into the envelope and returned the remaining documents to the lockbox. But this time I kept the flash drive hidden inside my robe pocket. Tomorrow morning, I would become exactly what Ryan and Claire expected me to be. Tired, confused, overwhelmed. I would nod softly during conversations and ask harmless questions and pretend not to understand legal language. I would let them believe grief had weakened me, because sometimes the safest place to observe dangerous people is directly beneath their sympathy. And for the first time since standing beside my husband's grave, I realized I was no longer the only person in this house keeping secrets. The next few days became a performance. Every conversation inside the house felt staged, polite on the surface and poisonous underneath. I moved carefully through each morning, pretending grief had drained my concentration. I asked Ryan to repeat simple information. I stared too long at paperwork before setting it aside with trembling hands. I let Claire explain financial terms slowly, the way people explain technology to elderly relatives they assume cannot keep up anymore. And with every passing hour, both of them relaxed a little more. That was the dangerous thing about underestimating someone. People stop hiding themselves. On Tuesday morning, I shuffled into the kitchen wearing one of Thomas's old navy sweaters over my robe. Claire stood at the counter reviewing papers beside her laptop, while Ryan drank coffee near the sink. The smell alone nearly broke my heart. Thomas always brewed dark roast coffee strong enough to wake the dead, as he liked to joke. Now Ryan used the same coffee maker while discussing legal timelines beside my husband's favorite mug. "Good morning," Claire said gently. "Did you sleep at all?" I nodded weakly before lowering myself into a chair. "A little," I whispered. "Everything still feels confusing." Ryan softened immediately at those words. "Not emotionally. Practically. Confused people are easier to manage." "That is understandable, Mom," he said. "Honestly, it would help if we consolidated things sooner rather than later." Consolidated. Another cold business word dressed up as concern. Claire slid a folder toward me slowly. "These are just temporary authorizations so Ryan can help manage bills and maintenance." I opened the folder carefully, pretending to struggle reading the pages without my glasses even though I had already memorized most of the language days earlier. Property access permissions. Temporary financial authority. Preliminary transfer review acknowledgement. They were building layers gradually, hoping I would eventually sign enough pieces to lose control without fully realizing it. I looked up slowly. "Do you really think I cannot handle things myself?" For a brief second, genuine discomfort crossed Ryan's face. "That is not what I meant," Claire answered before he could continue. "Nobody doubts you, Evelyn. We are just trying to reduce stress during a painful time." Painful time. Everything sounded rehearsed now. I nodded quietly and pushed the folder back toward her. "Maybe tomorrow," I said softly. "My head hurts today." Claire smiled immediately, even though disappointment flickered briefly behind her eyes again. "Of course." Later that afternoon, while Ryan took a phone call outside, Claire walked through the house with a realtor. She did not realize I heard them from the upstairs hallway. The property value increased significantly after the renovations, the realtor said quietly while examining the living room. Claire lowered her voice, but not enough. "We are still evaluating timing. His mother is struggling emotionally, so we need to be delicate." Delicate. I stood silently beside the staircase, gripping the banister so tightly my fingers ached. They were discussing the future sale of my home, while Thomas's slippers still sat beside our bed upstairs. The realtor eventually left through the front door, while Claire remained in the foyer, checking something on her phone. Her reflection caught briefly in the hallway mirror beside me. Perfect hair, cream-colored coat, calm expression. I wondered if she ever truly loved this family, or if she simply loved what this family owned. That evening, after dinner, Ryan approached me carefully while I sat in the den pretending to watch television. "Mom," he began cautiously, "Claire found a retirement community about 20 minutes from here, just as an option eventually." I kept my eyes fixed on the television screen for several seconds before answering quietly. "A retirement community. It is actually really nice," he added quickly. "Private gardens, walking paths, full staff." I finally looked at him then. My son. The little boy who once cried because I missed his school concert due to the flu. The teenager who begged me not to sell the house after Thomas lost his job during the recession because he loved his childhood bedroom too much. Somewhere between then and now, that boy had disappeared. "Your father planted every tree in this yard himself," I said softly. Ryan rubbed his forehead impatiently. "Mom, this is exactly why these conversations are difficult. You are making everything emotional." Emotional? I almost smiled at the irony. A widow discussing her home less than 1 week after burying her husband was apparently too emotional. But a son organizing property transfers during funeral week was practical. Before I could respond, Claire entered carrying teacups on a tray. "Maybe tonight is not the right night for heavy conversations," she said sweetly. Ryan sighed and leaned back against the sofa. "I am just trying to do what is best." I lowered my eyes to the untouched tea in my hands. "I know," I whispered, "and I meant it." Ryan truly believed he was doing what was best now. Not for me, for himself, for the life he and Claire wanted. That was the saddest part of all. He had convinced himself greed was responsibility. Later that night, after both of them went upstairs, I quietly called Harold Bennett from the kitchen using the old landline Thomas refused to get rid of. Harold answered immediately despite the late hour. "Evelyn," he said softly, "I have been waiting for your call." I closed my eyes briefly as relief washed through me. Finally, someone in this nightmare still sounded honest. Harold Bennett arrived the following afternoon, just after 3 o'clock, carrying a dark leather briefcase worn soft from decades of use. The moment I opened the front door and saw his tired gray eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, I nearly started crying from relief alone. Harold had been part of our lives since before Ryan was born. He stood beside Thomas at our wedding. He attended every Thanksgiving dinner for 20 years after his own wife passed away. More importantly, Harold was one of the few people Thomas trusted completely. "Evelyn," he said quietly, squeezing my hand gently. "I am so sorry." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Grief sat heavily between us in the front hallway while rain drifted softly outside the windows again. Connecticut seemed trapped in endless gray weather lately. Harold removed his coat slowly and glanced toward the kitchen, where Claire sat pretending to review paperwork beside her laptop. Ryan stood near the sink with his arms crossed tightly across his chest. Both of them looked surprised to see Harold arrive unannounced. Claire recovered first. "Mr. Bennett," she said politely, "we did not realize you were stopping by." Harold nodded once. "Thomas asked me to check on Evelyn personally if anything happened to him." The room became very quiet after that sentence. Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside the counter. "Dad never mentioned that." Harold placed his briefcase carefully on the dining table. "Your father and I discussed many things privately." Claire's smile tightened slightly. I noticed immediately. She disliked situations she could not control. Harold turned toward me gently. "Would you mind if we reviewed a few legal matters together?" Ryan stepped forward before I could answer. "Actually, Claire and I have already been helping Mom organize most of the financial paperwork." Harold looked at him calmly over his glasses. "I am sure you have." Nothing in his tone sounded confrontational, yet Ryan immediately looked defensive anyway. That alone told me everything. We moved into Thomas's office while Claire prepared coffee in the kitchen. Harold closed the office door behind us before lowering himself carefully into the leather chair across from the desk. For several seconds, he simply looked around the room quietly. "Thomas loved this office," he murmured softly. "He said it was the only room in the house where your flower arrangements could not reach him." Despite everything, I smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like my husband. Harold opened his briefcase slowly and removed several folders. I spoke with Thomas many times during the last year, he said carefully. Toward the end, he became increasingly concerned about pressure surrounding his estate. I lowered my eyes. Hearing someone else confirm it made the betrayal feel painfully real all over again. He left me a letter, I whispered. Harold nodded as though he expected that answer. Then you already know more than Ryan realizes. He slid a thick document toward me across the desk. The official trust agreement. Not the altered versions Claire kept trying to place in front of me all week. The real one. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Harold pointed calmly towards several sections already marked with notes. Thomas transferred primary control of all shared assets directly to you before his death, he explained. The house, investment accounts, retirement holdings, everything. I looked up sharply. Everything. Everything. Harold confirmed quietly. Ryan remains a beneficiary eventually, but only under very specific conditions. A cold silence settled across the office. Slowly, Harold removed another document from his briefcase. An amendment dated only 2 months earlier. Thomas added behavioral protection clauses after concerns regarding coercion. My stomach tightened. Coercion. Harold sighed heavily before leaning back in his chair. Your husband was worried someone might pressure you emotionally during the grieving process. Outside the office door, I could hear faint movement in the kitchen. Cabinets opening. Claire's heels against the hardwood floor. Listening. Harold lowered his voice slightly. If anyone attempts to manipulate property transfers, inheritance decisions, or residential displacement before a formal review period ends, they automatically forfeit significant portions of the estate. My pulse quickened instantly. Thomas had protected me more carefully than I ever realized. Harold continued speaking calmly. Legally speaking, nobody can force you out of this house. Nobody can override financial authority without your consent. And based on these documents, your husband clearly intended that protection to remain absolute. Tears burned behind my eyes again, but this time, they carried something besides grief. Safety. For the first time since the funeral, I finally felt safe. Suddenly the office door opened gently. Claire stepped inside carrying a silver tray with coffee cups arranged neatly beside folded napkins. I thought everyone might want something warm, she said sweetly. Harold thanked her politely while watching her with the careful expression of a man who spent 40 years reading dishonest people for a living. Claire placed my coffee beside the desk and glanced briefly at the documents spread open before us. I hope everything is making sense for Evelyn, she said lightly. Harold folded the papers closed immediately. Quite clearly, he replied. Something shifted behind Claire's eyes then. Not panic exactly. Calculation. She smiled again, but the warmth no longer reached her face. That is good, she said softly. We all just want what is best for family. Harold waited until she left the room before speaking again. Your husband asked me to tell you one final thing if matters reached this point. I looked at him silently. Harold's voice softened. Thomas said you spent 43 years protecting everyone else. He hoped that, just once, you would finally protect yourself first. Everything changed after Harold's visit. Not outwardly at first. The house still looked the same. The grandfather clock still chimed every hour. Rain still drifted against the windows most evenings while cold October air settled across the backyard. But beneath the surface, something had shifted completely. I no longer felt trapped inside my own grief. I understood the rules now. Ryan and Claire believed they were guiding a confused widow toward practical decisions. Meanwhile, they had no idea the entire foundation beneath their plans had already collapsed. The next morning, I found Claire sitting at the kitchen island reviewing real estate listings on her laptop before sunrise. She quickly minimized the screen when she noticed me entering the room, but not before I saw photographs of modern condominiums and retirement communities. You are up early, she said smoothly while closing the computer. I poured myself coffee slowly before answering. Thomas always woke up before 6. My body still expects to hear him downstairs. For once, Claire looked uncomfortable. Genuine grief made her uneasy because it interrupted the version of events she preferred to manage. Ryan entered a few minutes later already dressed in business clothes despite taking leave from work for the funeral week. He kissed Claire lightly on the cheek before glancing toward me. Mom, there is something we should probably finalize today. There it was again. Finalize. Everything in this house had become about completion dates and legal efficiency. I sat quietly at the table while Ryan placed another folder beside my coffee cup. These are simplified versions, he explained carefully. Harold tends to overcomplicate things legally. I almost admired the confidence required to insult the attorney who helped build my husband's financial empire while standing inside my husband's home. Almost. I opened the folder slowly. This time the language was more aggressive. Preliminary residential transition planning. Asset coordination authority. Temporary occupancy restructuring. Such polished words for something so cruel. Claire folded her hands carefully beside the laptop. We just think it would be healthier for you long-term if you were somewhere with support. Support, I repeated quietly. Ryan nodded immediately. A smaller place. Less responsibility. Less isolation. I looked around the kitchen slowly. The white cabinets Thomas installed himself after watching online tutorials for 2 weeks. The brass drawer handles we argued about in a hardware store for almost an hour because I wanted silver instead. The corner near the windows where Ryan used to sit doing algebra homework while I cooked dinner. Isolation. There are few things colder than being told your memories are now impractical. And what happens to this house? I asked softly. Ryan hesitated only briefly before answering. Eventually, we would probably sell it. The market is strong right now. We, not you, not the family. We. Claire reached for my hand gently across the table. You know we would never let anything happen to you. I looked down at her perfectly manicured fingers resting lightly against mine. A strange calm settled over me then. Not anger anymore. Certainty. Claire truly believed kindness, spoken softly, erased the cruelty hiding underneath it. Before I could answer, the front doorbell rang. Ryan frowned immediately. Are you expecting someone? I shook my head. Claire stood first, smoothing her sweater before walking toward the foyer. A moment later, Harold Bennett entered carrying another leather folder beneath his arm. Ryan's entire posture tightened instantly. Harold, he said carefully. We already spoke yesterday. Harold removed his coat slowly without looking at him. I am aware. Claire forced a polite smile. We were actually just reviewing some family planning documents. Harold glanced briefly toward the folder beside my coffee cup. I would advise against signing anything this week. Silence filled the kitchen immediately. Ryan crossed his arms tightly. With all due respect, Harold, Mom asked us to help her. Harold looked at him for several seconds before speaking. Did she? Ryan's jaw tightened visibly now. You are making this harder than it needs to be. Harold placed his folder calmly onto the kitchen counter and opened it. Actually, Ryan, I am trying to prevent you from making a life-changing mistake. Claire stood perfectly still beside the island while Harold removed several papers and slid them toward me first. Official trust amendments, legal directives, financial protections. Then finally, one page Ryan clearly recognized immediately because the color drained from his face almost instantly. What is that? Claire asked quietly. Harold adjusted his glasses before answering. A behavioral forfeiture clause added by Thomas Carter 2 months before his death. Ryan stared at the document silently. Harold's voice remained calm and professional. Any attempt to pressure Evelyn regarding residential relocation, property transfers, or estate control before the protected review period expires automatically reduces inheritance distribution substantially. Claire's composure cracked first. That is ridiculous. Harold turned toward her slowly. Your husband's father apparently disagreed. Ryan looked at me then for the first time in days without confidence behind his eyes. Only confusion. Mom, he said carefully. You knew about this? I held his gaze quietly across the kitchen. Your father wanted me protected. The room became painfully silent after that. Outside, cold rain continued falling across the backyard where Thomas once planted roses every spring. And standing there inside the kitchen he built with his own hands, I finally watched my son realize something that terrified him more than losing money. He realized I was no longer afraid of him. The house became unbearably quiet after Harold left that afternoon. Not peaceful quiet, careful quiet. The kind of silence that settles over people after the truth finally enters a room and refuses to leave. Ryan barely spoke during dinner. He pushed food around his plate, while Claire maintained the same calm expression she always wore in public, though I noticed she checked her phone constantly now, as if searching for solutions that no longer existed. For the first time since Thomas died, neither of them mentioned paperwork. Neither of them mentioned retirement communities or simplifying my life or selling the house. Fear had replaced confidence. And strangely enough, I did not feel victorious. I only felt tired, deeply tired. That night, after they went upstairs, I walked slowly through the house, turning off lights one room at a time. The den, the dining room, the hallway beside the staircase. Thomas used to tease me for doing this every evening before bed, even though half the lights were already off. "You are fighting a war against electricity," he liked to joke. I paused beside his leather chair and rested my hand gently against the worn armrest. The grief still lived inside me. Losing my husband still felt like walking through life, missing part of my own body. But somewhere, between the funeral and tonight, another loss had settled beside it. I was grieving my son too. 3 days later, Ryan knocked quietly on my bedroom door just after sunrise. I was already awake, sitting beside the window watching pale morning light spread across the backyard. The roses Thomas planted looked thinner now with winter approaching. "Come in," I said softly. Ryan entered slowly with both hands shoved into his coat pockets. He looked older than he had a week earlier. Exhaustion lined his face beneath unshaven stubble, and for the first time in days, he looked less like Claire's partner and more like the little boy I used to comfort after nightmares. He stood near the doorway for several seconds before speaking. "Claire went back to the city this morning." I nodded quietly. "I see." He swallowed hard. "She thinks Harold manipulated you against us." "Against us?" Such a revealing phrase. I turned my eyes back toward the window. "Did Harold manipulate your father too?" Ryan did not answer immediately. Outside, cold wind moved gently through the trees along the property line. Finally, he sat heavily in the chair beside the dresser and lowered his head into his hands. "I do not know when everything got so complicated," he whispered. I studied him silently. Complicated. Another word people use when they do not want to say greed out loud. "Your father was still being buried," I said quietly. "And you handed me legal papers." Ryan flinched as though the memory physically hurt him. "I know. You whispered at his grave that I needed to stop crying and sign documents." His eyes closed immediately. "Mom, please." I stood slowly and walked toward the window overlooking the backyard. "Do you know what hurt the most?" I asked softly. "Not the paperwork. Not even the house." My voice trembled slightly, then steadied again. "It was realizing how quickly I became inconvenient after your father died." Silence filled the room. Ryan stared at the carpet without speaking. For several moments, he looked exactly like a child sitting outside a principal's office waiting to be punished. But we were long past punishment now. Some things break quietly and never fully repair themselves again. "Claire kept saying we were trying to help," he finally whispered. And I convinced myself that was true. I nodded slowly. That is the dangerous thing about selfishness. It rarely sounds cruel when people are saying it to themselves. Tears gathered in Ryan's eyes then, though he fought them back quickly. Dad really changed the trust because of me? I looked down at my wedding ring still resting on my finger after 43 years. "Your father loved you very much," I answered carefully. "But he saw what fear and money were turning you into." Ryan covered his face with one trembling hand. For a moment, I almost walked over to comfort him out of habit alone. Mothers spend a lifetime soothing pain in their children. But grief had finally taught me something difficult. Loving someone does not mean protecting them from the consequences of who they become. 2 months later, I sold the Connecticut house on my own terms. Not because Ryan or Claire pushed me out, but because staying there without Thomas eventually became too painful. Every room echoed with memories strong enough to stop my breathing sometimes. I moved to a small coastal town in Maine where the ocean air smelled clean and cold and honest. My new home sat less than half a mile from the water with white shutters and a narrow porch just large enough for 2 rocking chairs. Sometimes in the mornings, I still catch myself reaching for a second coffee mug before remembering I live alone now. Ryan calls occasionally. Our conversations remain polite, careful, unfinished. Claire has never called again, and perhaps that is for the best. Some distances exist for a reason. Last week, I stood beside the Atlantic Ocean wrapped in Thomas's old Navy sweater while winter waves rolled endlessly against the shore. The wind was sharp enough to sting my cheeks, but for the first time in months, I felt calm. Truly calm. I used to believe losing my husband was the hardest thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. The hardest thing was realizing the son I raised disappeared long before I buried his father. And some grief does not come from death at all. Some grief comes from finally seeing people clearly.